I was also able to reach out to Mr. Maharaj, Omar, who agreed to be on here. And hopefully we will have the Minister of Agriculture from Trinidad and Tobago joining us. What I want us to do is kind of get this global picture, okay? What's happening? We have the issue of food security or insecurity, right? We also have a pandemic, and then we have to kind of, I hope we're kind of thinking about what happens post-pandemic to make sure that we continue to have access, not just to food in general, but to good quality food, right? In a place like South Carolina, where I live, we think about, this is in the United States, it's a first world country, a developed country, but we know we have issues of hunger and access to good quality food. In a place like in Trinidad, which is, the technical term is messy, complicated because of our taste and our relationship to agriculture, you know, our dependency on imported food stuff. These are all issues that are rooted in history and culture and behaviors. So I want us to come together to kind of talk about these things. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Beasley, and then after Mr. Beasley, Mr. Maharaj will talk, and hopefully by then we have the minister online and he can come and say a few words as well. And then we'll come back together and just have some Q&A from the audience.
Well, Professor Allison, thank you very much. It's great to be with you, particularly in this new role that I've now done for about 4 years. When I arrived here, sort of kicking and screaming because I didn't want a job and didn't want to engage into the UN system like this. And I got talked into it by a lot of friends in the United States Senate, Republicans and Democrats that came together and said, you've got to do this to help protect the funding. But anyway, just long story short, here I am 4 years later. We won the Nobel Peace Prize and we received that gracious honor just a couple of months ago. And what an extraordinary thing. And so what the Nobel Peace Prize Committee was doing, in my opinion, was sending two very clear messages. One message was, thank you, World Food Program, for your women and men who put their lives on the line every single day, bringing peace and stability in dozens of countries around the world. And then I think the second message was, your hardest work is yet to come. It was a call to action for 2021 because of the catastrophe that we're now facing because of the COVID economic and supply chain ripple effect. When I joined the World Food Program, my goal was to put the World Food Program out of business. In other words, we would have sustainability, resilience, and we wouldn't need, external support. However, because of man-made conflict, climate extremes and climate change, as well as COVID, et cetera, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So when I arrived at the World Food Program 4 years ago, the world's largest, by the way, humanitarian operation, just last year, we assisted about 114 million people. We raised about $8.9 billion. And when I arrived, we were at $5.9 billion, raising about $16 million a day. And so now I raise $24 million a day. That's $1 million per hour. And I need to raise about 1.5 million per hour to achieve the minimum goals and objectives we need for this year, for 2021. But when I arrived in 2017, the number of people around the world, not chronically hungry, which is about, give or take, 700 million, the number of people literally marching to the brink of starvation was 80 million people. 80 million around the world. Roll the tape forward. At the end of 2019, the number had spiked to 135 million. So the first question that any of you would ask is, why? Why did it jump? Well, the number one answer is man-made conflict. And I mean that gender specific because it is man-made conflict. It's not woman-made, it's man-made, number one. Number two is climate change and climate extremes. I've talked to a lot of my friends who questioned the climate change. I said, well, won't you just come with me? You can debate what's causing it to change, but just come with me and let me show you how it's devastating communities around the world. And so, because these are the places that we are in. When you feed 114 million people, you know what's going on in the neighborhood, wherever that might be. But now we've got COVID. And so because of COVID, the number of people marching to the brink of starvation has jumped now from 135 million to 270 million people. Now, let me just encapsulate this in a very clear, concise message. If we don't get the monies that we need, you will have mass famine, starvation, you will have destabilization of nations, and you will have mass migration. It's a lot cheaper to go in and address root cause and do it on the front end than wait till it's too late and you end with war, conflict, migration, violence, disturbances, and chaos. And I can prove that anecdotally, experientially, with the numbers. I'll just give you one simple example. In Syria, where we feed about give or take 2 million people, it's a place where it's deteriorating as we speak because of the impact of COVID and pricing of commodities, et cetera, and 12 years of war. We can feed a Syrian inside Syria for about 50 cents on a day. That same Syrian that ends up in Berlin or Brussels, well, the humanitarian support package is 50 to 100 euros per day. And guess what? The Syrian doesn't want to be in Brussels or in Berlin. They love to stay where their family has been for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But if they don't have food and they don't have some degree of peace and security, they go do what any of us would do for our family and our children. We would leave. In fact, from our survey, we survey all the time, they will move, in Syria, for example, they would move 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times before they eventually would leave their home country. And so if we come in and address root cause, and one of the things that we've shifted in the past many years, it used to be we would just come in and bring food. Well, that can be good in a short-term emergency, but sometimes it creates more dependence and doesn't create the independence and self-reliance and sustainability that we all would like. I haven't met a food recipient yet that says, hey, I love sitting down and doing nothing but bring me the food. I mean, they want to be independent. They want to take care of their own families, particularly the 800 million smallholder farmers around the world. And the women, oh my gosh, in the countries that we're talking about, they've got the most entrepreneurial spirit you've ever seen. So we like to come in and work and rehabilitate land and create opportunity and power. We're probably the biggest, largest women's empowerment program in the world. And we have time, we can break that down. And so the numbers, as I was speaking, have been going up, up, up. So about March of last year, before COVID was dynamically devastating globally, but it was really starting to take root in a lot of countries around the world. The young folks won't remember Tony Blair, but everyone else will. Tony Blair, who used to, be the leader in the UK, called me, and Tony said, David, you travel around the world more than anybody, meet with leaders, see more countries on the ground than anybody. What are you seeing out there? And I said, Tony, I'm very worried. Leaders are making decisions about COVID in a vacuum. And I said, if we continue to do that and shut down supply chain and shut down economies, the cure will be much worse than the disease. I said, we can't do that. We must work these two pandemics, COVID, health pandemic, with a hunger pandemic together. And if we do that, we can get through this and people will survive and thrive again. So he said, you've got to go speak to the United Nations Security Council and give them what you just gave to me. And so I did. A few weeks later, went and spoke to the United Nations Security Council and laid out what we must do. And fortunately, the leaders around the world responded. They responded with monies. 2019 had been a strong economic year, so we had a lot of monies in reserve that we could pull out to step up and help more people like we did, up to 114 million people. 30 million people out of the 114 depend on us 100%. They don't get food unless they get it from us. Imagine if those 30 million were cut off. And that would be what we call 30 million in IPC level 4. Like, for example, DRC has 5.7 million in IPC level 4. Now, that's literally right before famine. People are starving to death at IPC level 4. 5 is just the worst case scenario. Yemen, 5 point something million. I can keep going. Afghanistan, 4 point something million. Well, these people will die if we don't get there with food. And you can imagine what chaos and destabilization, death, and migration will take place. So it's critical that we get the support. But it was also critical last year that we help countries around the world. For example, developing nations had debt service, trillions of dollars of debt service in places all around the world. And so we asked that all the financial institutions, for example, defer debt payment to the financial institutions and allow that to go to national social safety net programs to help people through this difficult time. And so you can imagine, and we faced this in several places where a leader shut down a community. You know, in the United States, the odds are the average person's probably got 2 to 3 weeks worth of food in their pantry. Now, your children might not like what you're eating on the second or third week, but they're gonna be okay. But not in the places we are. They live hand to mouth. They don't have a pantry full of food. So when you do a lockdown, you're going to have either starvation or you're going to have conflict and mass migration. And so we would come in and establish safety net programs, as we did with about 50 countries, et cetera. But let me also add, not many people realize we do more than food. We are actually the logistics humanitarian backbone for the United Nations and NGOs. For example, in COVID, when the airline industry shut down, passengers, cargo weren't flying into Africa. So what are you going to do? Well, that's where we step up. In fact, we stepped up and supplied the aircraft necessary. We've got about 120 aircraft, not to mention the ones we lease, to step up on a basis like this, where we transferred cargo about 145,000 cubic meters into 171 different countries, 28,000 passengers during the height into about, I think it was 68 countries or 71 countries or something like that. Now the airline industry has figured out how to step it back up, work through the COVID pandemic much more strategically than they were a year ago at this time. And so the list goes on. So let me give a real quick, Allison, a little good news. 200 years ago, there was 1.1 billion people on Earth. 94% of the people were in extreme poverty. Today, less than 10%. So we've built systems that have improved the sharing of wealth around the world. But try telling that to the 10% that are struggling. And so the answer is not tearing down the systems that are working. The answer is tearing down the systems that aren't working and improving the systems that are not quite reaching that final 10%. And so when I go into a community in a country, I'm like, all right, how long have you been here? Okay, you've been here 30 years and you don't have zero hunger yet. What's not working? Is it not enough money, or the program's not equipped right? What is it that we're missing? And how do we make certain that, because we're all connected, and our philosophy is love your neighbor as yourself. And to me, it's like, okay, everybody, we're all equal. That's what, when you go to the ancient Torah, it was love your neighbor as your equal. We're all brothers and sisters. I'm no better than you, and you know better than me. We're all together. I don't care your religion, your culture, your ethnicity, your religion. We should, when someone suffers, we all suffer. And so when I go and see a child suffering, that's, I want to see that as my child or my little brother or my little sister. And so the World Food Program, our people out there every day, when, I hear people say, well, the UN's not that efficient. Oh my gosh. Well, the World Food Program, we know if we save 25 cents, that's a meal for a child. So we're always looking for ways to be innovative, creative, efficient, effective, because I don't know if you remember Scott Pelley with 60 Minutes. Scott and I were doing a big story about a year ago on Yemen, which is another big story. Yemen, Tigray, Ethiopia, which I've just visited those countries just last week. And so actually heading back to Yemen in a couple of weeks. But anyway, Scott was so moved by the footage and the story of what we were doing inside Yemen, and we were at the end of the interview, and Scott was taking my mic off, and he says, "Governor, you got the greatest job on earth." And I said, "Scott, I really do." I said, "But I'm gonna say something to you that you haven't thought of, and it's gonna bother you." And he looked at me like, "Well, what could that be?" I said, "Scott, I don't go to bed at night thinking about the children we saved. I go to bed at night weeping over the children we couldn't get to." And I said, "Scott, when we don't have enough money or the access we need, we have to choose which children eat, which children don't eat, which children live, which children die. How would you like that job?" And he was just blown away. He said, "My God, I never thought about it." I said, "Well, we have to think about it every single day." And what really bothers me, in 2020, the world's 2,200 billionaires increased their net worth by an average of $5.2 billion per day. Per day. All I need is $5 billion just to avert famine with 30 million people. Just 5 billion, 1 day of their net worth. Is that too much to ask for the wealthy to step up in a crisis time like this and help humanity? There's $400 trillion worth of wealth on the earth today. It's inexcusable that any child or anyone should die from hunger. We had last year, I think, give or take 2 million people died from COVID. We had 9 million die from hunger and hunger-related causes. This year, that number could be double, triple, or quadruple. It's inexcusable. And it's not just on the other side of the ocean. It's also, we have hunger in the United States. But it's inexcusable, a shame on humanity. But Allison, I could go on and talk about the programs we do and how we're changing the dynamics, and it's just extraordinary what the World Food Program does. But let me just stop there and let Omar talk, and then we'll get into some questions that might be burning on people's hearts. Thank you.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts, Allison, and thank you for that presentation, Director Beasley. I recognize from the listen my Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Rambharat, joined. And I also saw Dr. Anil Prasad, who is also from the University of the West Indies and a familiar face in the audience. So my perspective is really what I do. I'm guessing your audience would have no idea who I am, which is why I took the opportunity to share this little pictorial for a few minutes to help give some context in terms of course, in the face of Director Beasley's worldview, to show that there are activities on the ground. Of course, we do not have access to budgets and funding as he does, but in more really what I would call public education and awareness activities that has really sort of snowballed in terms of advocacy over the years. And I think as an individual, it has really, I've seen it grow because I've been involved in this for some time. And a lot of the things that I know that we germinated in the past has actually borne fruit at a national level here in Trinidad and Tobago. So people might be wondering, well, where is Trinidad and Tobago? Where is this place? They've never heard about it probably and so on. Well, actually, we are the most southernmost Caribbean country. I'm sure all of you would have heard about the Caribbean before, the sun, sea, and sand, beautiful people and places and so on. And among these Caribbean countries, we actually have the third highest GDP. And that really attributed to the fact that we have a large energy sector here, unlike most of our regional partners who depend on services, and services mainly tourism. But maybe 50 years ago and back in 1962, we became an independent nation. In those years, if you read about Caribbean history or Trinidad and Tobago history, you would see that our country would have relied on agriculture. It was really the mainstay of this economy. And we speak about the colonial crops, for example, which lasted for some time, which is like your cocoa, coffee, the sugar industry, eventually banana. And we had a thriving rice industry, and a lot of those export in later years, a lot of those were exported to the UK, for example. And of course, it evolved to the European Union. And there were some trade disputes in more recent years that caused us to lose that preferential market. Because of course, in the world, there are other producers of similar crops, and these are generic commodities in terms of your rice, sugar, and bananas. And you have other countries wanted to participate in that market, such as Brazil and so on. And it became a trade dispute, and all of it is history now. But the point is, we lost that lucrative market. But it remains that here locally in this sunny island state, that we do have all the tenets of agriculture existing. We have a fishery. We do depend on it for local consumption. And of course, this is parallel to a high import dependence in terms of food. And as I started by saying, we did have the per capita income that sufficed that type of behavior. And in economics, your students would know about the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. And because of that, we really tended to produce and export those commodities in which we had a competitive or comparative advantage, such as those in the energy sector, which we thought were capital intensive. And of course, we paid less attention to the labor intensive sector or the other side of the economy, which unfortunately is agriculture. So in later years, which brings us to the present, we now speak about agriculture. And a few years ago, I did a presentation here at the university. We organized something called the Conference on the Economy, where I asked the question, can we turn agriculture and fisheries into our new oil and gas? And that was in 2016. And of course, as history would have it, the rents, the benefits of our energy sector are now relatively decimated. And the state of the economy is as it is. The colorful picture there that you see is a snap from our Trinidad and Tobago Carnival. It's described as the greatest show on earth. For those of you who have heard about it, of course, you had liberty to check these things on the internet and be amazed at our country afterwards. I wanted to share just a few things in my minutes, just a few of the activities we have been doing over this time, which contributes to an awareness of our food situation, because as Director Beasley rightly said or suggested, the world has a growing attention to where our food comes from, how it is produced, and by extension, of course, I think we need to pay more respect or understand the circumstances of the men and women who work to feed us. And that simple statement really ties into the whole rambling about this industry. Why is agriculture so important? Why everybody should be involved? Some people tend to think that this conversation about agriculture only involves farmers, for example, and the role of fisherfolk or fishing communities is there to a minor extent. Even your household or your home food production, household food security and home gardening, all these efforts are tied into that in terms of contributing to the national food mass. So in 2012, we formalized an activity called Eat Local Day. And very simply put, 2012 is when Trinidad and Tobago celebrated its 50th anniversary of independence. And it was really a sort of grassroots effort from the farming or the agriculture perspective that would help us celebrate our independence. And we did that, or we thought to do that, by really showcasing the types of food, the diversity of the local food basket, and really trying to start a conversation about the potential of these things for processing and manufacturing. And you can imagine that because we were a high income economy and our people are well traveled, we have a diverse population here and so on, our appetite, our diet has really been open to the world. So if you look around at the restaurant chains, for example, you'll see elements from all over the world in terms of Indian foods, Chinese foods, American fast food chains, all of it is here. So, but the thing is, we have spoken about the diversity, the richness of the local food sector. If you speak to the average individual, they will swear by local foods in terms of its preparations and contents. But in fact, when you look at the data, or you look at the consumption habits and the resultant health and other issues that we could link back to your consumption habit, it tells a different story. So this has remained a form of advocacy over the years. And most recently in 2019, we couldn't do it in a formal way last year, unfortunately, due to the COVID lockdown regulations and so on. In 2019, I was able to have the university adopt this activity, where we were able to host it on the university's field station, which is a farm, a demonstration farm for practitioners and students. And we were able to bring school children there primarily. I think we had about 300 plus of them, really eating 100% local meals and so on. So, but that also links to other things that we do. So we have something called the Breadfruit Trees Project, and you'll see my t-shirt afterwards. It says 1treeforme.com. And a lot of these social media handles are registered to us, such as breadfruittrees.com. And it's really a civil society effort. It's a long-term effort. Of course, it logically doesn't bear fruit immediately in terms of, again, Director Beasley's demonstration that, you know, people are hungry now. We appreciate that, yes. So this particular effort is more medium to long term. Of course, these trees will bear fruit by about 3 years or so on average. But the idea is we need to start planting now. We need to have that food source in the ground now. I'm proud to say that I think within the last 2 years, we were able to distribute just over 4,000, or should comfortably say a few thousand of these trees to individuals. But before the lockdowns, it was to schools, places of worship, community spaces, and other people doing planting efforts. These trees are food trees. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the crop itself, but in other places, it is actually, other countries, it is actually used as a poverty reduction tool. It's also used to mitigate hunger and its related issues because it is a solid and versatile food mass. All right, so there are other formal organizations such as the Trees That Feed Foundation that do a lot of work in the Africas and the developing countries, and they are based in the US actually, Director. So it's really looking at those organizations, their experience, and pushing forward here from our local, as I said, a grassroots civil society perspective. So there's a caption there in terms of breadfruit, climate change, and a vision for food security. That's actually a headline from Forbes magazine. And very lucky for us, they sort of featured this effort some months ago, and it really gave this project an international view. And we have been able to attract conversations with people in the region, such as the CARICOM Secretariat and other places, who ask about this food. What is this about? Why it is you're so amazed or enthused about this and so on. And it's really, we could carry this conversation, I mean, at length, but it's really to say that it's about protecting medium to long-term food security. Because if we talk about the usual vegetable gardens and the soft food production, of course, they are able to feed you for a short while, you know. These trees, a breadfruit tree, will actually outlive each of us here on this Zoom call at the moment, right? So they've lived for several decades, 50 plus years, and so on. So, but put all of this together, why it is we are so important, see this as so important, why it is we choose to be involved in advocacy. Where I sit, of course, I've dedicated most of my later years of life in terms of my field of work, my field of study, and I've lent that experience and expertise to people involved in the sector, whether it be small and micro entrepreneurs, farming and fishing organizations, different types of groups, women's groups, youth groups, community groups, and so on. So sort of mix, get in their space and understand the role of agriculture. Because generally, we speak about agriculture having a lesser role, lesser importance on the national development agenda. So for some years, of course, we have been looking at reducing food imports, but at the same time, it's not to say that we can wipe it out. There must be some level of dependence, because if you look at manufacturing, for example, we're not being ignorant to say, oh, shut it down. You know, some people usually take that perspective, you know, why are we importing so much and so on. But in a country like ours, when we do import concentrates and intermediary products, it feeds our manufacturing sector. So for example, tomato paste might be coming from Israel or some other country. It goes into our manufacturing sector. And, you know, many miles away, that tomato paste is turned into ketchup, you know, the condiment that we use on chicken and chips and these other meals. But along that value chain, it created thousands of jobs for factory workers, food scientists, security guards, people in marketing and advertising, and so on. So it's not to say that we are not mindful of the role of imports in the economy. It's just that we are mindful of the increasing dependence on it and why we should boost our domestic resources. And then we came to COVID. And just to tie up my little few minutes here in terms of why Alison invited me, is that I have had the benefit in recent years of looking at food production from different angles. So I've looked at it, I think, across this country, within the CARICOM region, Guyana and St. Vincent and so on. And I've had two opportunities to look at agriculture, at least in terms of policy planning and development initiatives, in both India and China. And I see them as being among the largest producers of food in the world, and they have used agriculture in a way that engages poverty reduction. And that's really where my passion and focus is. And so I thought to share some of those experiences when we now look at what the COVID situation could possibly do to an economy like ours in terms of course, addressing food security needs and so on. When the COVID pandemic had, just came about to be this thing and countries were locking down and so on, of course, in a country like ours, there was a lot of uproar, a lot of conversation about where we're going with agriculture, what we have here. A lot of people at home, I mean, we championed a great movement through that time in terms of home gardening and so on. And from it, several entrepreneurial initiatives were born, such as the yard market, which is something I organize, and several others across the country. A lot of new people came into the sector and so on. And people were saying, well, where were we? Where are we going with this thing and so on? So, but at that time, it created the awareness, the conversations in the place. Why agriculture? Why is this so important? And suddenly people understood, regardless of how much money they had at that time, they still need to find food, and it became very topical. And my view was that not immediately, of course, our supermarket shelves are thankfully stocked for the while and so on. We do see some changes in terms of prices at the local level and supply shocks and so on. Recently we had a shock with animal feed. We have some issues with eggs, poultry and so on, but that's a whole other issue. It's just to say that this COVID-19 pandemic has the capacity to obliterate small island states like ours. So, but it sets the tone for vision and leadership. And that's my view. I've always had the view that this is a sector that needs vision and leadership. And if it has vision and leadership, then it requires an approach of consultation, collaboration, and coordination of the already scarce resources that we already have in this economy. So, and by doing that, of course, it raises the issue of agriculture on the national development agenda. And it is, of course, linked to rural development, linked to all the things that people talk about, your health, the economy, employment, all these other things. But so it means that, of course, I'm not satisfied. I've been around and I don't have all the answers, but I think I have a different perspective. I obviously have a different perspective. Each of us have a different view and, different priorities and interests and so on. And we've done this thing. We've been feeding ourselves since, Adam and Eve, or since whenever we look at when the story began. But today, the point is today, we still have perennial problems in this sector. We still keep wrapping our fingers around issues without being able to put some to rest or even show new growth and aspiration and so on. And this is really my opening pitch in terms of what I've been involved lately. And I think that it comes back to a policy issue because you need policy, program, project development. Of course, you need resources because already we are within a smaller fiscal space. And how long are we going to continue this idea of import dependence? We need to look into that, see what it is we are eating, build local capacity. It sounds very easy, it sounds straightforward, but strange enough, it is not, the reality doesn't play out as simple as that. So I thank you for the opportunity to make these opening remarks, and I will now give way to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Omar. And let's invite Minister Clarence Rambharat to please join us. Thank you.
Good morning, Rambharat. Thank you very much, and thanks to the previous speakers for offering their perspectives. Governor Beasley, I think you understand this best because you are a former politician. Maybe you still are a politician. The first point I want to make 6 points, but the first point I want to make is this. Even as COVID took hold in the United States and started to affect manufacturing and some of the farmers, we saw something that we've grown accustomed to, and that is excess production, because farmers no longer had the cruise ships, for example, the restaurant trade, but the cruise ship, the loss of the cruise ship business was a significant blow to agriculture. Farmers did not have that. So you had excess production, but you also had food shortages across the US in a way other countries did not have. You had long lines, you had people having difficulty to access food. And that is something that we've lived with for decades. Oversupply, excess stock, and still a level of difficulty in being able to access food. The second point I would make is that what we have now is the end result of liberalization, and I had my stint in it. When we were negotiating, for example, when the Caribbean region was dealing with sugar, and I have a background in the sugar industry, but when it came to that point when we had to accept the removal of preferential prices and negotiate an exit from sugar production with the Commonwealth Sugar Organization, the ACP countries having to negotiate that. It was obvious that once you had liberalization and once we are operating in a WTO system, it was going to be the survival of the biggest and the fittest and those who had the economic resources to grow. So throughout, whether you were in Italy making silk, or whether you were in Trinidad and Tobago doing honey, or wherever in the world you are, Grenada doing nutmeg, the WTO system of trade liberalization led to a series of factors that are now fully exposed by COVID. And the factors were consolidation across the world, the creation of a global food system through vertical and horizontal integration, the increase in mergers and acquisitions, particularly in the food and beverage industry, and the recognition that big was good, because the bigger you are in terms of primary production, your ability to transfer primary production into processing, distribution, you stood a very good chance of dominance. But for every large food company that emerged, it crushed small farmers and small companies across the world. And that is something that we in the region, in the Caribbean region, but even in larger parts of the globe, they've had to deal with the dominance of global food production, processing, and distribution systems. Even before the WTO, or perhaps that consolidation facilitated by the WTO, was driven in part by the fact that our consumption patterns around the world, but particularly in the Caribbean region, has changed significantly. If you go to India, if you go to China, if you go to Africa, you would see the consumption patterns have changed. People moved away from traditional food sources and traditional diets, and driven by North American television and driven by North American media, and driven by some of the trade agreements we signed, our consumption patterns have changed significantly. So our diets have changed. For example, in the Caribbean, our diets have changed from primary production to highly processed imported food that is very, very low in nutrition value. Our consumption of sugar-laden soft drinks. So we have copied a North American culture of consumption, and that has to do with consolidation of food systems, the marketing and the infiltration of cable television in our region, and the impact it has on parents and on children who are exposed to that type of advertising. The the reality is that by the time COVID set in, and we started to deal with it in March 2020, by the time COVID set in, any discussion, in fact, I made the rounds in the media, being blamed for making the point at the start of our response to COVID. I made the point that I was asked about a post-COVID plan, and I said, you know, we are in survival mode. We're trying to keep the country afloat, keep food coming in. This was not the time to talk about the food import bill and reducing the food import bill. As a matter of fact, wherever in the world our food could come from, we would have to take food from wherever it comes from, because we have to ensure that we are able to feed the population. So it was the equivalent, even now, in a sense, it is the equivalent of trying to make structural repairs to an aircraft that is in free fall. And it was not the time, and maybe the lessons learned would influence what we do or what we accelerate. But the point is that COVID was not the time for us to engage in a lot of discussion of how we got into this position. But the next point I would make is this: COVID emphasized a few things based on the behavior the behaviors that were immediate. And I would say 5 things in relation to what COVID brought out. One, COVID definitely brought out this issue of sovereignty and survival of the fittest. So we saw Russia, we saw the United States immediately taking positions that they were going to restrict exports of certain commodities, and they were going to take measures that ensured that their food supply, their internal food supply, was preserved. So sovereignty, the sense of nationalism, that people were looking now at this this liberalization and these trade agreements and thinking about, you know, how could we go it on our own? Why are we attached to this? Why do we have to open our markets to other countries when we may have the opportunity to feed ourselves or to produce our own food for this? So this sense of wanting to go it alone was a product in the early parts of COVID, and there's still some element of that existing. On the issue of sovereignty is not just in terms of preserving what is within your borders. The point that Omar made about livestock feed, for example, is an example. While our grain importers have long-standing contractual arrangements with suppliers out of the US, the fact is that when China looks after its business and decide that they're going to be shipping via vessels which have double and triple the capacity that you would normally have, when that vessel wants to pull up in a port for loading in the grain terminals, that is built infrastructure and you can't move it around and you don't have flexibility. But when China decides that a massive vessel has to find a spot in a grain terminal, all the other small vessels with about 150 capacity that supply to our part of the world move aside. And sometimes what would normally take a day or two to load has been taking about 2 to 3 weeks. So part of the attitude towards sovereignty and looking after myself and my country has been using that dominance, access to foreign exchange, access to shipping, access to fuel, and the ability to pay suppliers in cash has been leveraged to the disadvantage of smaller players. The COVID has exposed the weaknesses that small islands like us face, and the weaknesses are in relation to things like foreign exchange, for example, has been exposed as a critical weakness, access to foreign exchange. So once you have pressures on your demand or any pressures globally, or you have situations where people have switched their business and moved from something to another, to producing something else because the demand exists, a lot of people were demanding cash. So if you have importers like we have that require 90 and 120-day credit, and when you require forex, those weaknesses have been exposed. So it is not just operating in an environment, because we must import staples. Now, it's not just locking into long-term supply contracts and pricing, it is locking into other things like credit and access to finance and access to forex in the local markets. And of course, with the absence of tourism, with the weaknesses in the energy sector, you realize that you're bitten both sides, because you don't have the things that generates foreign exchange, and now you have a demand to have ready foreign exchange, and also the local currency to pay for it. There is the issue of volatility. The global markets, and but the food market in particular has been hit by volatility, and it has to do with the usual combination for example, in grain, the usual combination of weather. So grain is heavily dependent on weather at the growing stage and at the harvesting stage and at the shipping stage. So you have the traditional weather issues, but now you have the shipping issues, you have the cost of fuel issues, and then you have the protectionism, where some exporters are holding supplies for local consumption. But you have volatility in the global meat market, you have it in dairy, and it has to do with the uncertainty of COVID. It has to do with the additional costs that COVID brings in the manufacturing process, and all end to end, from farm to table. COVID has brought in some additional expenses. So you have price volatility, and those are things that importing countries will have to deal with, either by importers absorbing or the market absorbing it. I would make the last 2 points by saying this. The fact is that the fundamental has not changed. In our part of the world, the heavy reliance on imported food content is hitting us both ways. One, to a lesser degree, it is hitting us in terms of how much foreign exchange it consumes and the way it displaces local production in the market. But more importantly, we cannot talk about COVID and we cannot talk about food without emphasizing the issue of the deteriorating quality of health across the globe. The fact is that processed food and low nutritional quality has driven NCDs around the world, while we're watching our traditional expenses. For example, our national security costs in Trinidad and Tobago is about even now with healthcare, but healthcare is just going to continue growing, and the cost of healthcare and the pervasiveness of NCDs is driven by the change in our consumption patterns and the significant reliance on imported processed food content. So if ever there is a case for redesigning the way the world produces food and the way the world consumes, if ever there is a case for doing that, it has to be the overall health of us on the planet, and the way in which the healthcare around the world, wherever you are, the healthcare costs has become a dominant factor in economic planning. And the last thing I would say is that we can't de-risk the world of food production, and we can't de-risk food. Food will always have risk, because even if you did not have the need to ship and the need and the exposure to weather and so on, you'd always have. It is the nature of the business is that it comes with risk. So we'd always have risk, and we always have the need for food to move across borders and across seas. We have to factor in that risk, but we need to focus on the areas in which COVID has exposed the vulnerabilities and given us another opportunity to examine it to reduce the risk factors.
Okay, so thank you to all the gentlemen this morning for kind of giving us a very global view, right? I hope everyone in the audience was able to kind of synthesize some of what was being said. I think it's really important for us to understand that while we see an agency like the World Food Program stepping in areas where there is a crisis, right? That we also have to find ways to partner with with this agency and with policymakers like the minister, as well as with our community activists and our university folks, to try to avoid these crises and to use best practices when a crisis does develop to have an effective intervention. A few minutes left.
Maybe I could make 3 quick points on what you've said, Alison. One is that Omar will tell you that I've spoken about land tenure across the globe. Land tenure, and you made a very important point. A lot of it has to do with historical issues. How, for example, how we arrived in the Caribbean region, and how the land was distributed and how the tenure has been held historically. I mean, we have a different experience in Trinidad as Barbados, for example. But the fact is that land tenure is a big demotivator. It's something that could do a lot, and we've been doing work to improve it. But the fact that we've not attended to that has been a very significant factor in the region. And I forgot the other 2 things I wanted to say, so that might be good.
That's okay. It comes with age.
No. I wanted to make this point. You made a very good point, and I don't want Governor Beasley to be upset. But the fact is, I mean, I lived in North America, and I volunteered at the food banks. The fact is that the the lowest end of the food ends up in the food bank. But of course, the people you meet there have the fact is that the clientele may not have access to heat or ability to cook. They want to be able to consume quickly, so we get the canned food to them. We get the most popular food in a food bank is mac and cheese. We know why we do that. The carbs are important sometimes to them, but the fact is that at the lowest level of food in Trinidad and Tobago, to me, the bright thing we've been able to do in COVID is that we have had a long-standing food support program, which is a food card that is given and you use it at the supermarket. But with COVID, we were able to switch some of the clientele from that 30,000 persons and give them an actual 100-pound box of fresh fruit and vegetables. It meant taking up some of the excess supply from the farmers and placing in the hands of the most vulnerable things that they could cook. We've done the same thing with the school feeding program. The children were at home, and we were able to distribute some of those boxes to the homes. But
he said so many things I would respond to, because it's just tremendous opportunity out there. At the same time, how we've shifted, as I was saying earlier, we bring a lot of food from the outside, but now we actually purchase billions of dollars locally, because we're trying to, inspire the local economies, empower the local smallholder farmers. And the dynamics of how we've shifted over the past few years has just been remarkable all over the world, because the solutions that we're talking about are going to require everybody to be involved. One of the things, in addition to, last few years, we've planted with our beneficiaries like billions of trees, rehabilitated millions of acres of land. The stories are just remarkable. Last year alone, we built, and I say we, our beneficiaries, built 650 kilometers of roads, 60, 70 miles of dikes and dams and reservoirs and things like this. Now, one of the things that I'm doing with talking to some of the big agri companies is that, look, your bottom line is important. I get that. But I need for you, I'm not as much interested in your philanthropy. I need for you to come and engage in developing nations and help build better practices and not displace smallholder farmers. Do it in such a way there's long-term stability and success, which means you might have to make a little bit less money over 5 or 10 or 15 years. How about that? But bring stability and food security, et cetera. I know we're out of time and I've got to run, but there's so much to talk about. It's so exciting to hear everybody and to see everybody. I wish we had a lot more time, but Alison, thank you so much. It's great to be with you. Let me just say one last thing. The South Carolina congressional delegation particularly Jim Clyburn, who had his, wore his colors at the inauguration with his hat. I was so proud of him. And Lindsey Graham. These two leaders have been warriors for the World Food Program. And I mean that. I call it, when you look and turn on the television today, you got Republicans and Democrats fighting over everything. But when I go to Washington, it's like the Democrats and Republicans lay aside their differences and come together on international strategic food aid. It's really a beautiful thing. I call it the miracle on Pennsylvania Avenue. So there's some good out there. And I'm looking at the young generation to step it up, love your neighbor, and let's quit being so much animosity out there today. Let's learn to forgive, reconcile, and move forward and love each other as our equals. If we do that, we're gonna build a great world. But right now we're struggling. So Allison, it's great to be with you.
Thank you so much, Governor Beasley. I know there's a question in the chat for Omar and the minister. How does home food production advocacy, the home food production advocacy movement interact, and I just lost the screen, I'm sorry, with the needs and demands of the commercial agricultural sector? So I don't know if either, Omar, you want to try that?
Well, from my perspective is the language and that is a bit tight, but usually people ask, well, if more people producing food at home, how will that impact farmers? They figure that people don't need to buy things at the market anymore, so the farming population might lose income. If that is the perspective of the question. But it's really not a matter of competition, it's a matter of ensuring that you have enough, ensuring that the household itself is able to manage the limited budgets that they have. A lot of people face reduced incomes now. I mean, I was only speaking now because the purpose of the chat was, the conversation was about surviving in this COVID pandemic. But the fact is people are rearranging the way they spend, rearranging their priorities and so on. So if they could invest their already limited resources into paying for a few of their meals per day or per week by providing home food production through that movement, they also benefit from other things in terms of their recreation, their personal health, as the minister described, that point he raised, and all the other things, and even the surplus. So in my little few minutes to open, I was speaking about entrepreneurship. So my household, for example, is an example of that, where we went into the producing, we went into the seedlings, all these softer things, encouraged others to do so, and by extension created a movement and a forum through something I call the yard market, where people could now come and sell what they have, whether it is produce or processed product inputs. Really it is focused on all things that are handmade, homemade, or locally driven. But in terms of commercial agriculture sector, these things, within a household space, if you look at the urban or the suburban designs, at least here in Trinidad and Tobago, people cannot knock off all the things that they consume. You can't logically produce all within that space. So they do depend on the markets, the supermarkets, and so on. So it's not a matter of impacting their demand or taking away from any market opportunity there. But it's really, as the minister used the word of sovereignty and sufficiency. And I think it is always worthwhile to build that form of capacity.
Minister?
Yeah, I think Omar has explained it. The thing about it is that home gardening, well, let me just go back, different stages, I suppose in every country, but in our part of the world, there have been, highs and lows with home gardening. We went through some periods when it was really, we had competitions and all of that. But COVID, it may be a Caribbean thing that people are afraid to die. So COVID really struck fear. And initially, in our lockdown, from the outset, the farmers were never locked out. So we kept markets open, and the farmers and their workers were able to plant and all of that. So the food kept flowing, and the markets from the outset were met the protocols. So that allowed people farmers to plant, and it allowed people to be able to buy. But we also at the same time launched a project called Grow Trinbago, which is the current version of the home gardening, and we gave out 5 or 6 different types of seeds, and it was very good, and I've seen people do a lot with it. And I've seen where people have moved and they want to plant something. In fact, there's a slogan I use, plant something, but it's not going to displace anything from the market. What it means is that you have other things taking place. So for example, in most households now, you don't have a large refrigerator, for example. So people don't buy things that would last them a week. So what will happen is that they will supplement what they buy with some things that they grow. And the combination of buying in the green market and growing will displace some of the processed food if we get the message right about the more you eat, that closer to where food is produced, the better health results you're likely to get. So I don't see it happening. And then, of course, the case I make for home gardening is that you can't get better mental and physical relief than that. Money that you spend by the psychiatrists and psychologists and doctor, you're gonna save it in gardening, because it involves some bending, some moving, some walking, some thinking. And it is really good. It's really good for the mind.
So Omar, do you want to end?
Sure. Well, I have a few lines or maybe some thoughts I could just tie up. I thank the minister for his views and his participation, of course, and Director Beasley in his absence. And I just want to leave with this anecdotal statement. I'm not even sure how much in your group there knows about the breadfruit trees, but I play with this thought in my mind just to put people to thinking that in our small island state, some years ago, we would have spent, I think it was about $3 million to upgrade a golf course. And I remember making the point that, of course, that's the juggle people's thoughts, that I never played the game. I've never been fortunate to play the game. But the point was that $3 million in our currency could have purchased about 120,000 breadfruit trees. And the beauty in that is at maturity, they would produce about an annual average of 300 fruits for the rest of our lives. I made the point that these trees would actually outlive this generation. And that will translate really into about 90,000 tons of food mass to the national food basket. So it shows that there's so much, although we look at fiscal space being tighter, we could really readjust our lifestyles. The same way we had a conversation just now about nutrition and all this mindfulness. We could also look at different things we do in the public space, and it doesn't require only government funding or intervention. It really calls on people to step up and do their part, as we say, for a better tomorrow and so on. So, but my view, as I said in the opening, is that I am always mindful of the history of neglect of this sector. I didn't think it started recently or with COVID or in the last few years and so on. I call it a history of neglect. That's locally, right? It may not be the case in the USA or elsewhere. But I appreciate now that it becomes increasingly difficult to do certain things. We are in a recession, we are in a challenge scenario and so on. And a lot of the things, the ideas we throw up now, of course, they would have been better planned and implemented in better economic times, when we had more freedom of movement, resources, more people at the table and so on. So that's just me focusing on that pre-existing myriad of challenges. And as the minister pointed to, the land tenure issues, import dependence, the whole things in terms of predial larceny and so on. We could go on and on about the problems, but what we need is, of course, solutions, as you could imagine. So therefore, if we want to address food security in a country like ours, a small island state, Trinidad and Tobago, and we only talk about it, as he said, in the face of the global pandemic, then of course we remain in grave danger, because the conversations will only be anecdotal, piecemeal, isolated, and so on. It would not connect to perennial or systemic issues that we face. So I'm grateful for this collaboration, the time together, and I thank you all for the opportunity to share.
Minister, last word.
Thank you very much. It worked out that I was available, and it is very helpful. I hope that we could use the virtual center for further collaboration. And if there's anything more I could do or add, feel free to connect with me. And Omar is a very enthusiastic young man with comes from that background, but also has the academic connections. And he's done some work for us in the ministry, some good work on incentives and subsidies, and also on the marketing of agriculture products, in particular the research side of it, and how we collect and assure the integrity of data. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you to both of you, and again to Governor Beasley in his absence.